Mutsu Province, 1087. 4 brutal years into a siege, the court refuses to call a war. Minamoto no Yoshiie has just won and lost everything. His emperor will pay his soldiers nothing, so he sells his own land instead. But who was this man?
For over a decade, he never lost a war. Yet his own emperor refused to pay a single soldier. So why did Japan's greatest warrior end up paying for his own war himself?
Minamoto no Yoshiie was born in 1039 into a clan that occupied an uneasy place in Heian, Japan. The Minamoto were imperial descendants, stripped of royal rank generations earlier, and pushed into the messy business of war that the court preferred not to notice, crushing rebellions on the frontier. His father, Minamoto no Yoriyoshi, built the family's reputation as hired swords for a capital that valued poetry and court rank far more than the men who kept its provinces from collapsing. Yoshiie would inherit that reputation and push it further than any Minamoto before him.
At just 7 years old, Yoshiie underwent his coming-of-age ceremony not in a quiet family hall, but at Iwashimizu Hachiman Shrine, dedicated to Hachiman, the god of war himself. From that day, he carried a new name, Hachiman Taro, the eldest son of Hachiman. For a warrior clan desperate to prove its worth to a court of poets and priests, the name was a statement. This boy was not merely descended from emperors. He was, in some sense, descended from war itself, and he intended to live up to it.
That test came quickly. In the remote northern province of Mutsu, the powerful Abe clan had grown too independent, defying the tax collectors and officials the court sent to control them. In 1051, the court ordered Yoriyoshi north to crush them. He took his young son with him. What began as a routine punitive campaign against a rebellious frontier family would drag on for over a decade through freezing winters and burning stockades, and it would make Yoshiie's name a legend across Japan, long before he understood what that legend would eventually cost him.
The war against the Abe clan, later called the former 9 Years' War, ground on through freezing mountain passes and burning wooden forts. Yoshiie fought at his father's side through every brutal season of it, and soon soldiers were telling a different story than the one about his father. They spoke of a young man on horseback who could put an arrow through a galloping rider at full speed, who charged first and retreated last, who seemed immune to the fear that gripped ordinary men. He was still in his 20s. Already, they were calling him something more than a soldier.
One story from these years became legend in its own right. At a display of archery before startled officials, Yoshiie drew his bow and put an arrow clean through several layers of lacquered armor stacked one behind the other, a shot that should have been impossible. News like this traveled fast in a country where the court's own guards could barely draw a hunting bow. To ordinary people, and increasingly to frightened rivals, Yoshiie was no longer just a warrior. He was proof that the old aristocracy no longer held a monopoly on power in Japan.
by 1062, after 11 grinding years, the Abe clan was destroyed and the north pacified. Yoshiie returned to the capital a war hero, his name spoken with genuine awe. But the court's gratitude came with limits. Modest promotions, respectable, but nowhere close to what a Fujiwara courtier received for far less effort. The message, unspoken but unmistakable, was clear enough. Warriors could be useful, even essential, but they would never truly belong among the men who ran the empire. 2 decades later, Yoshiie would test that boundary again, under far worse circumstances. In 1083, the North called again. The Kiyohara clan, once useful allies against the Abe, had torn itself apart in a bloody succession feud. Now in his mid-40s, Yoshiie was appointed governor of Mutsu and marched north to restore order, or so the appointment officially read. In practice, he threw himself into the conflict on behalf of a young Kiyohara claimant named Fujiwara no Kiyohira, turning a family quarrel into a full-scale war. It would become known as the later 3 Years' War. And this time, the court had never actually authorized it as a war at all. Deep in hostile territory, Yoshiie's forces marched through a narrow valley when he suddenly raised his hand and halted the column. A flock of wild geese ahead had broken formation in mid-flight, scattering exactly as a military classic he had once studied described, when hidden soldiers below disturb birds passing overhead. Yoshiie ordered his men into battle positions. Moments later, an ambush that should have slaughtered his column met a prepared army instead. It was the kind of moment that turned a skilled warrior into a legend. Not brute strength, but the discipline to notice what almost everyone else would have missed. The war dragged into its final, grimmest stage at the Kiyohara stronghold of Kanazawa, a fortress ringed by cliffs and rivers that made direct assault nearly suicidal. Yoshiie settled in for a siege through the brutal northern winter, cutting off food and reinforcements while his men froze in makeshift camps outside the walls. Contemporary accounts describe defenders reduced to starvation and horror before the stronghold finally fell in late 1087. It had taken 4 years, most of Yoshiie's own resources, and immeasurable strain on his men, with no guarantee any of it would be honored in the capital. When Kanazawa finally fell, Yoshiie stood victorious over a war he had fought for 4 brutal years. A war that had cost him fortunes in supplies, hundreds of loyal men, and decades of campaigning stretching back to his first battles as a young man beside his father. Fujiwara no Kiyohira, the ally he had backed, now controlled the north unchallenged. The beginning of a golden age of Fujiwara rule in Mutsu that would last a century. Yoshiie sent word to the capital, expecting the formal recognition, titles, and rewards that any general who had just secured Japan's entire northern frontier surely deserved.
The response from Kyoto was devastating. The court declared that the later 3 Years' War had never been an official campaign at all, merely a private quarrel between provincial families that Yoshiie had chosen on his own authority to involve himself in. No war, no rewards. His soldiers, men who had frozen through northern winters and starved besieging armies for him, would receive nothing from the imperial government, whose frontier they had just secured. It was a calculated insult, designed to remind an increasingly powerful warrior exactly how replaceable the court still believed men like him to be.
Yoshiie's answer became one of the defining moments in samurai history. Rather than send his men home empty-handed, he began selling off his own private estates, land that represented his family's wealth and status, and used the proceeds to personally reward every soldier who had fought for him. It was financially reckless and politically audacious, a warrior openly declaring that his obligation to his men outweighed his obedience to an ungrateful court. The Eastern warriors never forgot it. From that moment on, their loyalty belonged not to the distant emperor in Kyoto, but to the Minamoto name itself.
That single decision reshaped the balance of power in Japan more than any battle had. Provincial warriors across the eastern lands began to see the Minamoto not as tax collectors serving a distant court, but as a family that paid its debts, even when the emperor would not. It was a personal, almost feudal bond, built on gratitude rather than law. In the short term, it cost Yoshiie dearly. But he had unknowingly built something the aristocracy in Kyoto could never fully control. A network of armed men whose first loyalty ran through blood and honor, not through the imperial court at all.
The court noticed, and it panicked. In 1091, the government issued a formal edict forbidding local landholders from commending their estates to Yoshiie, a direct attempt to choke off the flow of loyalty and wealth building around him. It was an extraordinary measure, reserved for men the court genuinely feared. Yoshiie, the general who had spent a fortune securing Japan's northern frontier, now found himself treated less like a hero and more like a threat to be contained. He kept his titles, he kept his reputation, but the path to real power at court had quietly, deliberately been closed to him.
Yoshiie spent his final years in a strange position. The most famous warrior in Japan, celebrated in songs and stories, yet permanently frozen out of the real corridors of imperial power. Family troubles compounded the isolation. A rebellious son, court intrigue, old rivals still resentful of his fame. He died in 1106, at around 67, without ever holding a rank that matched the scale of what he had actually accomplished on the battlefield. By any measure the court used to judge success, Minamoto no Yoshiie had failed. And yet, the story of Japan's warrior class was only just beginning.
Here is the irony the Kyoto court never saw coming. By refusing to reward Yoshiie's soldiers, they had pushed him into an act of personal loyalty that money from the treasury could never have bought. The Eastern warriors who received his estates didn't just remember a paycheck, they remembered a lord who bankrupted himself rather than abandon them. That kind of debt doesn't disappear in a generation. It compounds quietly, passed down through families who once fought beside Hachiman Taro in the snow of Mutsu, waiting for a Minamoto worth following again.
That debt came due nearly a century later. Minamoto no Yoritomo, Yoshie's own descendant, would call on exactly the kind of loyalty his ancestor had built in the northeast, and use it to crush the Taira clan, end centuries of court-dominated rule, and found the Kamakura shogunate, the first government in Japanese history run entirely by warriors. Yoshiie never lived to see it. He died believing the court had cheated him out of everything he'd earned. In truth, he had already built something far more permanent than any title Kyoto could have granted him.
Nearly 5 centuries later, another warrior family would face its own reckoning, this time not through a court's neglect, but through catastrophic defeat on the battlefield. In 1575, at the Battle of Nagashino, the Takeda clan's legendary cavalry was cut down by a wall of gunfire, and the man left holding the pieces was Takeda Katsuyori, son of the great Takeda Shingen. He inherited one of Japan's most feared armies. Within 7 years, he would lose everything his father built. Next time, we follow the son who couldn't escape his father's shadow, and the empire he couldn't save.
Minamoto no Yoshiie never received the rewards his court owed him. But 9 centuries later, his name endures in shrines, in legend, and in the bloodline of the shogunate that finally freed Japan's warriors from the aristocracy that scorned him. If you want more stories of the men who built and broke the age of the samurai, subscribe to Samurai Chronicles and join us for the next chapter in this story of loyalty, betrayal, and legend.